see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here with Dahlia Lithwick. Thank you for joining me for this talk.
Thank you for including me.
Yeah, so Dahlia, you're a senior writer, as I understand it, at Slate Magazine, as well as you studied law at Stanford University, so you're a lawyer as well. Is that right?
Well, I went to law school. I never practiced.
Oh, okay.
But I went to law school and I clerked, and then I moved over to Slate to write about the court.
Well, I've been following your work for probably about the past 3 years because you've written about empathy and how it relates to the Supreme Court. And I just what I want to find out about is about your interest in empathy, how you got started, interested in it, and kind of how it's kind of evolved over the years.
It's a great question. I'm not sure I've given it a lot of thought why I started thinking about it. I guess I would say the moment in court coverage where it became an issue was when Justice David Souter stepped down and President Barack Obama said that the quality he wanted to replicate in his next pick for the Supreme Court was going to be Souter's empathy. And that empathy, he said, was what was lacking at the court. And that, just as you probably recall, sent everybody completely bonkers and scrambling for the exit doors and unfurling the, democracy as we know it is threatened if we have empathetic people on the court. So that was when I think I probably started writing about this question of what does it mean when judges talk about empathy? Does empathy matter? Is there something about the notion of empathy that is antithetical to doing justice? And then I think layered over that, there was quickly, within weeks, when President Obama selected Sonia Sotomayor as his pick for the court, that exploded into a whole conversation about whether she was biased because she's a woman, because she's Latina. So whether there was this sort of excess of empathy in his pick that was going to render her, unfit to be a justice. So I think those two things happening in quick succession forced me to think a lot about these questions of what is empathy, how does it figure into justice, what does it mean for justices to exhibit empathy? And so I've been writing about it, I think, since then, almost always following that strand and trying to think through, particularly on gender questions, whether it makes a difference to have women on the court because they are somehow empathetic in ways men are not.
Yeah, well, when Barack Obama said that, like you said, it's like kind of all hell kind of broke loose. And for, like on Fox News, for almost 2 weeks after that, almost every program seemed to be about how horrible empathy was.
That's right. I thought it was such a strange thing. At the time, my boys were probably, I don't know, they were tiny. And I remember thinking, wait, so this quality I've been trying to instill in my small children turns out to be the dirtiest word in American political discourse. I mean, Obama, I think, was always very clear that to him, and he put this in his book, that empathy meant one thing and one thing only, and it meant walk a mile in another person's shoes, right? He attributes that to his grandmother, and he says his grandmother always said, before you jump to conclusions, walk a mile in the other guy's shoes. And that, I think, somehow, you're quite right, morphed into be biased, be unfair, put a thumb on the scale for people who look like you, put a thumb on the scale for people who are of the same race or class. So I think you're quite right. When we were having that fight, we weren't really talking about empathy at all. We were talking about something else that got kind of coded as empathy, and then it just became a really bad word. And you're quite right. I mean, the sound bites that were coming up, accusing Sotomayor, for instance, of being a racist and being a man-hater and being a bigot and a hysteric and worse, didn't sound like they had anything to do with this empathy conversation in the first place.
Yeah, so how is your kind of understanding of empathy evolved? Like, you've been looking at it for about 3 years now, and, writing about it, periodically, And you just had a recent article that you wrote about the relationship of empathy and Obama, talking about gay marriage. So I wonder if you could just kind of go through your history of maybe, kind of what was your understanding of empathy and how has it evolved to this point?
Well, I think for me, I've always been, right from the beginning, I've been covering the Supreme Court for 13 years, and I've always been powerfully moved by the stories that Sandra Day O'Connor has told, that Antonin Scalia has told, about what it was like to sit in a conference with Thurgood Marshall, and how his sheer magic when it came to storytelling, his ability to stop a conference in its tracks and say, wait, none of you grew up in the Jim Crow South. None of you, couldn't stay at a motel or couldn't stop at a public toilet. So I'm going to tell you a thing or two. And then he would just unspool stories. And everybody's perception of the world changed. And so I've always been incredibly moved by the idea that, you're having this court, which likes to hold itself out as 9 brains in a vat, plugged into the Constitution without any experience, without any personal, emotional response to anything, copying to the fact that, of course, storytelling makes a difference. And of course, when somebody tells you, wait, you don't know what you don't know, how powerful that was. And that even justices like Scalia and like William H. Rehnquist, who are very conservative, had their worlds upended by listening to Marshall. And so to me, I think that was the beginning of trying to say, if we acknowledge that that's a good thing, if even Scalia acknowledges that the power of telling a story, the power of reframing a question and saying, this is what it looks like through my eyes, if that's an important trait, then why does it suddenly become bad, either because it's an Obama nominee or because it's a woman or a woman of color? And so I think that the for me, watching the court, I think that these are these very human moments when the justices are able to talk past pure doctrine and to say, wait, you missed something. And I think for me personally, that really came, sort of hit a high watermark a few years ago in a strip search case, you may remember, where at that point, the only woman on the court was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And this was a case of a little girl who was strip searched because they were looking for ibuprofen that was hidden on her person, allegedly. Yeah. And the school authorities didn't call her mother and didn't warn her, and they humiliated her. And the oral argument proceeded in such a way that some of the men on the court were sort of giggling about, this is just like in gym class. Remember when they pulled your underwear up? And Ginsburg just became palpably horrified that this was being talked about as though it was kind of a cartoon. And so she not only said from the bench, it's nothing like gym class, but then she gave an interview while the case was still pending, where she said, this is why we need more women on the court, because men simply don't understand. They have no idea what it is to be a 13-year-old girl. And there was a lot of blowback for that. And yet the case came out 8-1 in favor of the girl, not the school. And right after that, the president put another woman on the bench. So I think these things do have salience. I think these moments at which the court stops and looks at itself and says, what have we not heard? Who are we not listening to? Are really kind of ground-shifting moments for me as a journalist, because you get to see that even though they pretend to be umpires, whatever that means, when they take off the mask, they're still people. And they can influence each other in ways that are very poignant if they can be bothered to listen.
So it sounds like it's the quality of the storytelling that by instead of just analyzing the situation, it's like when we tell these personal stories about how we're affected or how other people were affected, that we're kind of carried along in the emotions of what really happened to that person. So they can hear the stories of what it's like to be strip searched or live in Jim Crow and just feel the humiliation or feel the degradation or the alienation, and really see how their policies are affecting people kind of at emotional level.
I think that's exactly right. I wanted to talk to you about one of my favorite um, cases when was very much under the radar last term, and it was called JDB versus North Carolina, and it was a case that nobody really noticed. There was a seventh grader who was suspected in some break-ins. A uniformed officer comes to the school, takes this child, brings him into a classroom, has a bunch of other school administrators and officers question him, question him, question him. He confesses to it. And the question for the court was whether he needed a Miranda warning or whether he felt maybe he was just free to leave that classroom. Maybe he didn't think he had to stay there. And it becomes this amazing exercise in empathy where Justice Sotomayor writes for the majority of the court, and she tries to say, how would a child who's in a kind of custodial situation feel? Would he feel like he's free to leave the room? Would he feel, and she goes on to say, most adults wouldn't feel free in that situation to leave. Of course, he felt like he was being detained. But what was really, the child needed better Miranda warnings. And what was so interesting is Justice Samuel Alito writes for the dissent. And what he says is, I'm not even going to try to imagine my way into the head of a teenager, of your average 13-year-old in a school being, it's just, judges can't do it. And I just want to read to you what he wrote because I thought it was so interesting. He says he's worried for the, quote, 60-year-old judge attempting to make a custody determination through the eyes of a hypothetical average 15-year-old. He says, 45 years of personal experience and societal change separate this judge from the days when he was 15 years old. This judge may or may not have even been an average 15-year-old. And so not only does Alito refuse to put his head himself in the head of that child, he just refuses the project of empathy, but he thinks it's inappropriate for judges to even attempt the project of empathy. And so I love that colloquy back and forth. I love how Sotomayor, who, by the way, never was arrested as a child and doesn't have children herself and doesn't certainly, I think, have any great expertise on how a child feels when he's being interrogated. But she does the work of saying, I'm trying to imagine what he felt. And you have Sam Alito, on the other hand, saying, I don't even think this is a proper inquiry. And I think that was a real sort of interesting framing for the empathy discussion at the court.
So it sounds like you're kind of really looking at the Supreme Court and seeing how empathy is kind of manifesting itself or not manifesting itself. Has this been kind of like an exploration for you? I mean, you're kind of like really looking at the nuts and bolts of, where is empathy and how is it kind of playing out? Or
I think it is becoming a bit of an obsession. I think that there's a strange way in which the court is more and more disconnected from this country in deep, deep and profound ways. All the justices now come from 2 law schools. All their clerks come from about 7 law schools. The sort of bandwidth of what they experience gets narrower and narrower. And it seems to me that as that happens, there's an obligation to reach out beyond the bubble that is the court and to say, okay, what is life like out there? And I remember my favorite example, other than the one I just gave you, was a case that had to do with searches on Greyhound buses, drug searches, where the justices were trying to determine whether immigration officers could search in the bags in the overhead compartments, or whether passengers had a reasonable expectation of privacy in those bags. And as the discussion went on, I remember thinking, none of these people have ever been on a Greyhound bus. None of these people could even find the Greyhound station if they were, forced to. And that the work of the court has to be to reach out beyond their own experience and to think, what is it that I don't know right now? And so I guess I am sort of obsessed with it because it seems to me that the idea that you can be just a disaggregated brain in a vat doing justice, hoping that you're speaking for the millions of people that you don't know, when you're declining to really hear, I think is a really, really dangerous proposition.
Yeah, then it's kind of becomes a question of how does society bring more empathy into a situation like that, maybe structurally, or what are the ways of doing that?
Well, there's another quote that I love. I'm very careful in thinking about these issues, not to say, look, I'm not a brain science expert. I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist. I'm a Supreme Court reporter, and so I don't purport to be an expert on these things. And it worries me when people say we need women on the court because women are just, by definition, more empathetic, or we need minorities on the court because they're more empathetic. I think those are kind of difficult arguments to make, and I'm not sure I believe in them. I think we need them on the court to tell their stories and to force empathy on the other justices. But there's a really nice argument by someone called Joel K. Goldstein, who always reminds us, I think, that one of the court's finest achievements, which was Brown versus Board of Education, was decided by 9 white men. And it was decided by 9 white men because they were able to imagine their way into the heads and hearts of African American children in segregated schools. And they were able to understand that feeling of inferiority, that stain and the taint of segregation. And so I don't want to suggest that by definition putting women on the courts makes it a more empathetic place. What I want to suggest, I think, is that the court is at its best when, whether it's comprised of 9 women or 3 women or 7 women, when it's listening outside its own experience. And that the court did that in Brown. The high water marks for the court have always been, I think, triumphs of imagining yourself outside of your experience. But I think it is a dangerous thing to say, therefore we need more women on the court. I think, therefore we need more listeners on the court is probably where I would want to go with it.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's not just the gender, it's kind of the qualities, the human values and qualities that are needed and need to be maybe promoted and deepened, like listening. There's another aspect to this is that, with the, in the Senate, there was a lot of discussion about empathy. I don't know if you've seen the collection of videos I've collected. It was mentioned maybe over 500 times, and there's this debate going on about the nature of empathy, and Jeff Sessions was kind of leading the charge, against empathy. And from my sense is that the Democrats did not really address his concerns, that they didn't really know how to even dialogue about it. And I was quite disappointed in terms of that they just didn't. They just kind of let Jeff Sessions just kind of go on and on and on, and he still does it. Like, you can go back, and every chance he gets, he says, empathy, this empathy standard is horrible. We got to get rid of it. And every judge now, every circuit and district court nominee is asked to fill out a form. I don't know if you've seen that form, but it basically says, do you now or have you ever had empathy? Really, I mean, I have a whole collection of those, and every judge, every nominee has to say, well, this has been my experience with empathy. So it's, I'm kind of exaggerating the, it sounds like the McCarthy era kind of quality, but it's like, I'm like stunned at how the Democrats are not even using this as an opportunity to kind of educate about the nature of empathy and to address all those concerns. Like you mentioned, the concerns of bias, empathy is bias, empathy is, bring the finger on the scale, empathy is emotionalism, and then this between sympathy, they're constantly interchangeably using sympathy and empathy, and none of this stuff is kind of being addressed by Democrats.
I think that's not only is that completely true. I think, the Democrats during the Sotomayor hearings had a golden opportunity to explain, this is what we mean by empathy. Empathy doesn't mean you sit on the bench and weep as you piteously stroke the hand of the person that you feel sorrier for. Empathy just means listening. It means, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And it doesn't mean that you always have, a sure thing, that you always side with the person like you either. You're quite right. That's sympathy. But what was interesting is not only did the Democrats fail to sort of pick up on that strain of what President Obama was talking about, but you'll notice that Obama failed to use that language when he nominated Kagan. In other words, I think he threw empathy under the bus after it didn't work in the Sotomayor hearings. And in fact, I think it hurt her. I think that all of the discussions about empathy were very hard for her. And you may recall when she was pressed on it, she said, "Oh, heck, I'm not empathetic. I'm the least. I'm an umpire too." So she didn't do any kind of, really able defense of the notion. But then by the time it came to be, we're going to replace John Paul Stevens, who really was, I think, a profoundly empathetic man. And it might have been time to sort of jumpstart that conversation about empathy again. The president never used the word. The word it become, you're quite right, a dirty word. And so it's really true that there was this wonderful teachable moment to say, look, this is what all judges do. Samuel Alito, one of the most conservative justices on the court, said in his confirmation hearings that he would always have a special place in his heart for new immigrants to this country because, like his family, they would suffer all sorts of abuses. So it's not true that only liberals claim to have special feelings. It's that for some reason it's okay when a conservative jurist says it means they have a big heart. When a liberal jurist says it means they're, you're quite right, borderline mentally ill and going to weep copiously. And so I think that it was a really lost opportunity. And I think that the code underneath that entire conversation about empathy set back the sort of project of what judges do by reinforcing this idea that judges are robots. And we all know that's not true. So now that we've all kind of come around to the idea that judges are just robots, there's no place to talk about empathy anymore.
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking of is, and I've talked to some of the, I've interviewed a lot of the academics and scientists around, what empathy is and the nature of empathy. I'm kind of imagining almost like an empathy trial or a hearing. You know what I mean? It's like really, and bring in these experts who can actually, address these concerns. It's really, I think the conservatives have legitimate concerns. And instead of really hearing the concerns and then addressing them, it's like there's no real dialogue around this. And it's kind of like almost like a stalemate now. And for example, the bias, right? The one thing was that empathy is biased, that you'll have empathy for one side and it'll be for the person that's poor or disadvantaged in some way. And while, empathy can be that, you can have empathy for one side or just the other. Kind of what I'm looking at is a culture of empathy, which is really listening fully and deeply to all sides, to the stories that both sides have, and then being informed by that. So just talking about the aspect of empathy is biased and it's tipping the scales. I just wonder what your kind of thoughts are on that.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that we have a very, very misplaced notion of only certain squishy-headed liberals have empathy, and it's always for certain people, and it always perverts the judicial project. And I think you're right to say that the way to think about it has to be something to do with openness and listening. One of the things that I find so interesting at the current Supreme Court is that when you read Samuel Alito, I don't mean to be beating up on Alito, he's just coming up today, but when you read him talking about Christian students in California who don't want gay students to be in their club, and the deep and profound connection he feels with these students. So it's not, again, as though he's not empathizing. He's empathizing with one side, and quite passionately, and I think very compellingly. So I think it's just a huge mistake to say, or, Clarence Thomas, who empathizes with people who put up lawn signs during the Prop 8 conversation in California and had their signs vandalized. And Clarence Thomas is in pain for the bullying and the harassment that they felt. So I don't think it is the case that only one or the other side feels it. The question is, do you feel such empathy for one party that you can't hear the other? And it seems to me that across the board, liberals and conservatives at the court are guilty of that. And so it's not a right-left problem. And I think it's also true that if you can't be budged from that sense that one side is more compelling, more persuasive, that it tears at your heartstrings more than the other. You've crossed the line from empathy and sympathy into sympathy, and then you really are starting to talk about something else. So I think it's a really good point that the conversation happens in these caricatures of what each side feels and does, and it's more heat than light. I mean, there's not a lot of truth to any of these caricatures. And the truth is, we are, all of us, by nature of being human beings, incredibly sympathetic to people who are like us. The trick is to figure out how to move that. And I think that in a perfect world, one of the reasons I love the court and I love covering the court is that when it works, when you have 9 very smart people in a room together, and Thurgood Marshall is telling them, you don't understand, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg is saying, you don't understand. There is a way, that gentle persuasion, that dialogue and discourse. Nobody bops anyone over the head with a binder. They don't actually have gavels to hit each other. So it is a place where reasoned discourse, I think, can prevail. And that's why it's different than, rallies out on the streets where people are flinging epithets. There is a space in the judicial process for conversation and for persuasion. And so it seems to me that you're quite right, that the courts, in a way, can be a leader in sort of modeling how we do this. And when they choose to try, sometimes the results are really staggering.
So you're saying that the courts could model empathy for all sides. It's like kind of be modeling listening to every, deeply listening to all sides.
Well, that's what their job is to read briefs from both sides. Their job is to hear argument from both sides. So just structurally, systemically, the courts are an ideal place to show, hey, I really listened. I listened to both sides. But I think that what I see more often than not is the courts getting involved in picking sides and using their job to, berate the side they don't like. And that's been exacerbated, certainly at the Supreme Court, I think, in the last couple of years. But I think that there's this amazing opportunity to say, here's the last bastion of listening, not talking, listening. And here I give huge credit to Clarence Thomas, who hasn't asked a question at oral argument in, I think, 6 years now. And one of the reasons he gives is that I'm here to listen. I'm not here to talk and to browbeat the lawyers and to show out how smart I am. If I invite 2 people into my home to argue 2 sides of an issue, I owe them the courtesy of listening. And I think it doesn't mean that the justices shouldn't ask questions. It means it's not their time to be, juggling spinning plates and showing off. It's their time to listen. So I think as a structural matter, the courts are in a place where they could do so much better at showing the rest of us, this is what dispassionate, reasoned discourse, but with stories and storytelling and with open-hearted, benefit of the doubt conversation could really do.
Well, the other part that you kind of started to address was, you talked about was sympathy. And there's a big difference between empathy and sympathy, and they get used in the same sentences repeatedly. It's like suddenly, oh, we have empathy, and then it turns into the word sympathy, then it goes back and forth. And they're 2 very distinct processes. And sympathy, is kind of like how your affect, like how you've been affected by it, like feeling, oh, I feel sorry for someone or sympathy for someone. And so that's another kind of problem I'm seeing is that with the definition that there's this mix-up between those 2 terms.
I think that's right, and that we saw that happen instantly when Obama deployed the word empathy, and it got subverted to sympathy, and then that morphed into bias. In the span of 1 news cycle, we were hearing that the president wants biased judges, and I think it's the exact opposite of what he wanted. He wanted judges who had the capacity to live outside their own experience. And remember, he was replacing David Souter, this sort of funny, stodgy old bachelor from New Hampshire, whose life experience wasn't sort of vast, who didn't know, all about every aspect of this country, but who was really an acute and able listener. So I think it was a very, very apt moment to say, this is a quality that matters. And, I also think it's funny because one of the things we've seen happen more and more now is people insisting you don't understand. You're not me, so you don't understand. And I think that's a cop-out. I think that the beauty for me of the courts is you don't have the option of standing in front of the justice and say, you're not a 13-year-old girl, so you don't understand. You have the burden of persuading them. Here's what it's like to be a 13-year-old girl who's strip searched. Here's what it's like to be a 13-year-old boy who's questioned by uniformed police officers without his Miranda rights. So I love the idea that the courts are, again, a last bastion where the default setting we have come to in this country, which is unless you're me, you can't understand me and I bear no burden. I love that in the courts you do have to stand up and say, you're not me. So let me tell you what being me is like. Let me tell you my story. And that requires that the justices hear it. And that, again, I think is something that is all but, it's so vanishingly rare in the rest of public discourse. It's just very easy to get up and say, if you don't understand who I am and what I'm saying, I don't have to explain myself to you. Because that's the end. And at the courts, you don't have that end. You have to begin. You have to do the work.
Yeah, it's kind of like in society, we've become very polarized, and sides, the two larger poles aren't really listening to each other. So we have a media with two sides not really listening to each other either. So we have the media doing that. We have the Congress and the government kind of in that competition. But then we have the courts too, which is kind of like structured in this competitive system. So it seems to be kind of reflected throughout society. And it seems like you're kind of optimistic that, well, the courts are the last bastion of potentially, this listening going on, but it doesn't seem to be really working from my sense. It's like, and so it kind of sets up, there's people who are looking at alternative structures to this, and one of them is restorative justice. And I don't know how much you've looked into kind of the nature of restorative justice, and I would actually call restorative justice, I think it's kind of misnamed. What it really is restorative empathy. It's, bringing people together to actually reconnect, because there's some kind of a disconnection that's happened in a crime or something. There's someone's injured somebody else, harmed somebody else. And in a restorative justice process, it's not like, well, let's battle it out, which is kind of the structure we have now, is a competitive, gladiatorial, lawyers or the gladiators who are going to fight out this battle in the arena. And, we do have some judges there who are going to kind of help this. And then it still doesn't bring people together, whereas the restorative justice kind of model is all about how do we reestablish connection. So I'm just wondering, how you see that.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Before between law school and being a journalist, I worked at a divorce firm, at a matrimonial law firm for a couple of years, and watched what the legal process does to families, particularly to children who are, at this point so oppositional and willing to pay lawyers huge sums of money to fight about the Tupperware, to death, because it's not about the Tupperware.
Yeah.
And those, watching, what mediation and alternative dispute resolution, mechanisms that force you out of this purely, if he wants it, I don't want it. If she wants it, if she wants the kids, I want the kids. That way of thinking, which has been, a real disaster. I absolutely think, there's a famous article by Judge Richard Posner saying that maybe we should just decide custody by flipping a coin, because it's better than these legal processes that are just, destroying, annihilating families. And I agree. I think the system does huge damage. I think I want to just be careful to distinguish between legal processes like criminal trials and divorce trials, and the lawsuits you're describing, and what I see at the Supreme Court, which really is so abstracted away from the parties and their conflict. And that's its own problem. You never see the parties at the court. You never hear their stories, because it's about doctrine that is so removed from the conflict on the ground. So I think when I talk sort of romantically, and probably you're right, too romantically, about what I see at the court. It's because you don't see, with the exception of Anna Nicole Smith, who did come for one of her appeals at the Supreme Court, but you just don't see the parties there, and you don't see that oppositional thing. What you see is very, very abstract legal issues presented abstractly, and that, I think, is something that's modeling a good conversation. But I absolutely agree that when you're talking about in the trenches, in courtrooms across the countries, where people are willing to use their attorneys as a weapon of choice to destroy the other side, I think that isn't working. And I think that you're also, I think, completely right to say it reflects just a general sense in the larger society that everything is a fight, that everything is a fight to the death, and that there is some great shame in backing down, and that there's a loss of dignity and a loss of face in compromising. And, you're right, we see it everywhere. And, the other thing I thought about when you were talking just there was that this conversation we have about civility in the public realm, after Gabby Giffords was shot, and there was this brief moment, this brief sort of hysteria about civil discourse, that also has a lot to do with listening. It has a lot to do with empathy, because I think civility is also a code for, we use it to say, oh, civility is just about using polite words and saying nice things to each other. And that's not what civility is. Civility, I think, maps almost perfectly onto your definition of empathy.
Yeah, somehow for me, the civility doesn't kind of go deep enough.
Mm-hmm.
The civility is like, well, I disagree with you, you disagree with me, and we're going to be nice about it, kind of. Whereas the empathy is really kind of an effort to really create this sense of connection, to kind of find what is our common humanity, where do we really connect, and where can we see our deeper values, that, and make that effort to have that, to go that extra depth. So I guess this kind of brings me around to, I'm really looking at how do we build a culture of empathy? How do we make a societal transformation to raise the level of empathy within society, at the broadest level? How do we change the media? How do we change the government structures? How do we change the judiciary structures? Just how do we change the education system, commerce? How do we bring empathy into society to raise empathy as a national or cultural value? So just kind of wondering, what do you think about that kind of that broad view?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Again, as the mother of two young boys, I fear for the world we're going to give them, where we have two siloed medias that don't speak to each other, and where the presumption is that the other side is lying all the time, right? I mean, that's the animating theme, I think, is that everybody else is lying to you. There's a conspiracy. And I just think, in most cultures, there's medications for that. Believe that everybody is out to get you and to lie to you, and it's all a distortion. And so I think the complete and utter failure of trust, because I think once you believe the other side is lying all the time, you can never find it. You will never bridge that. And you're justified in doing whatever you think you have to do to counter it. So I guess what I'm saying is, once you assume bad faith, which is, I think, where we are in the media, in politics, certainly, in national congressional politics, possibly in the courts, once you're assuming bad faith, it's almost impossible to move forward. And so I worry terribly about it. It's one of the reasons I've started writing more and more about it. But at the same time, I think, I always loop back to, most people love their next door neighbor. They love their cousin, the person who doesn't share their political values, who doesn't think what they think about, deeply dividing questions, but they work through it. And so I do think it's these one-to-one encounters where you say, oh, you're not them, you're me. It's the I-thou problem again. And I think that the media is so outside of I-thou. The media is just Punch and Judy. So it seems to me that this begins probably, I hate to say it, but as a reporter, but by turning off your TV set. It begins by recognizing that most of what you see isn't real. It's manufactured conflict. Conflict gets ratings. I can tell you that as a journalist. And that that there are precious relationships all around you that you have with people that you don't agree with, but you give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think it's because you can imagine your way into their life. And it seems to me that I just don't know what we could do to fix the media. I don't know what we could do to fix Congress. I remember asking a congressman, what's changed? Is it really as bad now as it's ever been? And, there's all these funny theories about, they used to send their kids to soccer games together, but now they all go home. They have these basic connections that used to exist. And I remember him telling me once we invented air conditioning and people could go inside, they stopped talking to each other. So there's all sorts of very deep societal reasons for why we can't talk to each other. But I do really believe that if you look at your own life and how big your heart is in terms of a willingness to look expansively at people who are not like you once you know them, and that kind of goes back to empathy in the president. I think that's what he was saying. It seems to me that's how this gets fixed. And it really is something we model for our kids, I guess, and that hopefully they learn in school. But boy, as to the bigger project, I'm about as pessimistic as I've ever been that we can fix, the big systems. They seem to thrive on this.
Yeah, it's kind of like the big systems are kind of hopeless, but on this personal level, we have a lot of empathy when you're just meeting your neighbor, you're going home for Christmas, and family dynamics. There's a lot of empathy and connection there.
Yeah, a friend of mine sent me, I was writing about empathy, I think you noted 2 weeks ago, and a friend sent a note that said, it's so funny because everybody talks about, around your dinner table, around your dinner table, it's not that we all agree. We scream at each other, right, at Thanksgiving, and then we agree to disagree. So it's funny in the most profound way. The empathy isn't, you've persuaded me I'm an idiot. The empathy is, I love you anyway. And that's what I think is missing, it seems to me, in the larger discourse, is we've lost the ability, unless there's another shooting, and then for 3 brief days we will pretend to care to listen to each other. But I think that we have this notion that empathy is for special occasions. And I don't think it is. I think it's something that we all deploy in our lives all the time, but the media and politics don't reflect the fact that we are all empathetic most of the time.
Well, part of it might be with education. That's why I feel disappointed about the Senate. It was a real opportunity to have a real, national dialogue about empathy and bring in some experts, bring in the neuroscientists, bring in the academics, bring in the people who are working on the ground on it to really kind of flesh out and to address a lot of these concerns that were, I think, legitimate concerns that were brought up, and really hear the concerns that were brought up and address them and dialogue about them and kind of model empathy, within those hearings as well. And I think it's still a possibility for the future. It's there's going to be future nominations, and it can go back to talking about empathy at those, I would hope. I think you may be a little skeptical about it. You might be thinking that it's kind of hopeless, it's kind of over talking about empathy.
No, I think that I think that President Obama is such a, this is going to sound cynical, but he's a wonderful empathy pitchman. He's really good at it when he chooses to do it. I think there's nobody better. And so I'm thinking about his race speech in Philadelphia. I'm thinking of his civility speech in Arizona, the way he talked about his evolution on gay marriage. So I actually think he is the person. If there is a teachable moment, he is, as credible a spokesman for empathy as anyone in public life. I think that I worry that at least where it comes to the court, that conversation is over. It was sort of seen as a trial balloon. It had, it hit the ground with a thud. Sonia Sotomayor, who was the one person who could have, when asked about it, said, yes, this is what the president meant. He didn't mean bias. What he meant was, my life shapes my decisions. Wise Latina women may, in fact, come to better decisions in some cases, some of the time, and here's why. And instead, she said, oh my God, empathy. That's awful. So I don't know. Yeah. I'm paraphrasing, but she certainly did not, use the moment to teach what you're describing. So I'm not sure that that's the way we're going to have this conversation. I think that things need to change in such a profound way in our political discourse before the conversation can really become one of, it sort of requires, we're at a moment right now where everybody has a blog and everybody's tweeting and everybody's on Facebook and everybody wants to be heard. They desperately want to be heard. And I wish I could tell you how much mail I get from readers who are angry about what I didn't write instead of what I did write. Because I think it really goes to this problem of everybody feels like they're being ignored and they're invisible. Mm-hmm. And they sort of overcompensate by talking more and by being more aggressively sort of, forceful about, this is what is going on with me, this is what is going on with me. And I think that the more everybody is sort of pushing forward into that space, the less room there is to hear. And so it just seems, and this is, I guess, my only beef with, I love electronic media, I love that I work for an online magazine, but I think that there's a sense in which everybody feels like they're not being heard. And that's because everybody's talking.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's so great that you mentioned that, because I've been to the Tea Party rallies and have gone and said, tell me about empathy. And I've been to the Republican State Convention here in California, and I said, tell me about your views on empathy. And I've been to the Democratic Convention and to the Occupy. And when I went to the Tea Party, it was, we're not being heard. We're not being heard. You go to the Occupy, it's like, we're not being heard. We're not being heard. And it's like, it's amazing. It's exactly what you're addressing there. It's like everybody feels they're not being heard. And then the less you're heard, it's like the louder you speak. And then it kind of drowns out others, and the louder they have to speak, and it all kind of gets all ratcheted up.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that the more you think your speech is being suppressed, the less, again, it goes to that bad faith thing. The more you think everybody's censoring you or ignoring you, or that the mainstream media is marginalizing you, the more likely you are to be speaking in ways that are not terribly respectful and that are not about listening. So I've really come a long way in my view of the First Amendment. I think that the First Amendment talks about how we speak to each other, but really I think there's a sort of an unwritten provision that is about how we listen to each other. And that's the part that I think we're violating.
We need an empathy amendment.
Exactly. I like it. Good luck with that.
Well, just talking about what's kind of current at the moment, switching, is you'd written about gay marriage, and about empathy, saying it's about the empathy, and then Charles Krauthammer had just written something about empathy as well, and he had set it up that there's an empathic approach, which is kind of like this dialogue approach, and then there's the rights approach, and you create these rights, and then there's kind of the force of law to say this is the way it's going to be, which kind of in one way suppresses everyone from being heard and kind of having that deeper dialogue to kind of agree to develop that empathy. It's like, we're not doing empathy, we're just creating this law and you just obey it. So how are you seeing, you read that article, I'm just wondering kind of what your views are on that article.
I guess I just don't see them as in tension the way he sees them as fundamentally antithetical to each other. I mean, I wrote, in the same week, one article kind of lauding Obama's empathy, whether or not you believe he genuinely evolved on gay marriage, and I know most Americans don't. It's hard to believe that he evolved to a place that he had already embraced. But I think that what he was showing us was, I listened to my kids, I listened to my wife, I listened to parents at school, and I realized I didn't know some things. And you hear that very frequently. I hear it on the judiciary, people saying, I thought I knew what I thought, and then I started talking to people. Then I had a gay clerk, or then I had, my son brought home someone, and I rethought this. That's all I think the president was saying when he was trying to talk about evolution. And I'm not sure I see that as sort of antithetical to also saying it's a fundamental right that should be constitutionally protected. I do think that the president did put himself, and I think the Washington Post piece is right about that, in a tough spot by saying, yes, it's a deep and fundamental constitutional right, and the states should get to decide it. Because what that means, of course, is, and I wrote this last week, that in North Carolina, you get to not have empathy. In North Carolina, you get to just say no. And if it's a constitutional right, then states don't get to vote on it. That's just the way it goes. So I do think that he's put himself in a sort of logical bind, but I don't think empathy is the problem. I think the problem is it's actually a pragmatic question about whether courts should get out in front of public opinion or wait until public opinion resolves, and then it seems to me that's a normative question about how courts should do their job. But I don't see where empathy is a problem to that project. I think that there is a very, very vigorous debate in the legal academy about whether the courts have disserved certain minorities by getting out ahead of public opinion. So, maybe they made a mistake and the backlash to Brown was so severe, or maybe they made a mistake in Roe v. Wade and the backlash was so severe. So I think there is a feeling that the court needs to account for where public opinion is at, but I'm not sure that's an empathy problem. And I do think, and I think I wrote about this, that if you look at someone like Justice Kennedy, who has been incredibly conservative on most things. Justice Anthony Kennedy is the swing vote at the court, and he was the author of Citizens United. He's one of the most conservative jurists in the last 100 years. But on gay rights, he's been incredibly empathetic and incredibly sensitive to what it is like to be a minority that is disparaged and kind of created a second-class citizenship for them. So I think that it's an interesting problem, but I think that the way I frame empathy in the court is, how do we get justices to think on this issue the way that Justice Kennedy has thought on this issue, which is, oops, I didn't know everything and then I listened.
Yeah, I guess I was seeing that Charles Krauthammer's article. Kind of the way I was looking at it is, within society, we have this public debate that happens. So the thing is the public debate is happening within this very polarized media that we just talked about. So it doesn't seem to be, there's no real forum for, to have this discussion where you have maybe a conference in every city that's, small group discussions. You bring in the LGBT community, you bring in the, fundamentalist community, and you set people at, small tables to have sort of that restorative justice type dialogue where they're really getting to know each other, just like you're talking about, that personal, someone who is in either of those, backgrounds, and you can really see what their concerns are and feel what's important to them. So we don't seem to have that structure for supporting the empathic approach that Charles is talking about.
I completely agree. I think that it kind of goes back to the end of air conditioning in a strange way, that we more and more stay in our homes. We think that we are having a rigorous and zealous debate, but what we're doing is friending people who think like we do on Facebook and creating our own op-ed pages cherry-picked from the 10 newspapers that agree with us. I remember once saying in a speech, we are the most literate, best informed, ignorant generation in history, because we don't challenge ourselves, and yet we read and read and read, and we change our profile pictures on Facebook, and we're very, very active, but we're not, again, listening. And so I think it's one of the curses of the media today is that it has the capacity to be exactly what you're describing, but those Sunday morning talk shows that pass for, this is a town hall, we have position A and position B, and now they're going to have a reasoned discourse about it, are the furthest thing from that. So I think we sort of have the theater of discourse and the theater of, having actual dialogue, but in fact, we're just pounding each other. So I think it's true that we don't have those spaces. And yet, I would say, and this is just unique to the changes in the polling on gay marriage have been so dramatic. And sort of one of the questions that groups who fight for other issues are just all asking themselves is, how did we move the needle on gay rights in this country so dramatically in 2 decades? And so I do think, strangely, you have to take seriously what everybody calls the Will and Grace effect. That if you watch a mainstream NBC show for years and years about a gay main character who's very charming and winning, is that its own form of empathy? Is that its own? I mean, that certainly does shape opinions, and I you can't dismiss that. So it seems to me that in a strange way, the media can be a vehicle for shaping the way we think about things, at the same time that it's also polarizing us and making us shut our minds down. So I don't know where exactly to put Will and Grace in this conversation.
Yeah, it's when people are seeing those different scenarios and how people are acting and interacting, it is affecting them in some way. It's just, I kind of feel like, well, we can really ramp this up. I mean, it could be, there's a lot of potential in how to really, and that's kind of what you're doing, I think, by, talking about it and writing about it. And so where do you see your empathy work going in the future? Your exploration, what's kind of, what's kind of the burning interests around this?
Well, I'm really interested, in these questions that we talked about at the very beginning, these questions of what does it mean to the courts? And I have just started working on some materials on how the justices think about children and childhood. And that's why some of those cases we talked about earlier, the strip search case and the Miranda case, are really interesting. So I think what I will keep pushing for is the idea that whether they like it or not, judges have to imagine themselves in someone else's shoes every day. And you can call it empathy or sympathy or bias, or you can call it their job, but that's what they do. And so let's try to think of a way to see that as a good thing and not a bad thing. I will tell you that I'm a strong believer in bringing cameras into the Supreme Court, precisely because I think that when you watch an hour of very civil, very respectful argument by advocates and the justices, I know it seems to you like it's in a madhouse in there, but after 13 years, I can still say I think it's the last bastion of very civil, respectful, even empathetic dialogue. And I think if people saw that, instead of seeing congressmen, having tantrums, they would know that there's a space in the public sphere where this is how we talk to each other. And it is respectful, and it is thoughtful, and it is moderate. And modulated, and I think that can only help. And I guess the other thing is that I continue to look for opportunities to think about why it is that we're so afraid of empathy. That for me, I think the next twist in the project is to really unpack what happened there in that summer of madness over Sotomayor, and to unpack what lies under that fear. Because that I don't understand. Like I said at the beginning, these are qualities I teach my children more than all other things, is to imagine what the other guy is feeling before you punch him in the mouth. So I just think I want to do a better job going into the next round of confirmation hearings of thinking about what that was and why, and how we could talk about it in a saner way.
Well, regarding that part of it, because there's going to be probably more Supreme Court nominations in the next 4 years, and so this will kind of be revisited. And one thing I'm imagining is getting some panel discussions where we actually bring in different sides and can actually just do them like with Skype, like we're doing. So bring in the neuroscientist, bring in a conservative, bring in a progressive, and really try to structure it in a discussion. Bring in you, to really explore this topic. As you're saying, unpack it. Like, what really are the concerns? Why is it's not over. The discussion is not over, because if you look on that webpage I have of every time that this empathy was used in the Senate, I've kind of got it documented, and it's still ongoing. It's like every chance Jeff Sessions gets, for example, and a couple of the other senators, they'll say, empathy standard, this is bad, and all that kind of stuff. So the debate is still there, but it's just kind of at a low boil. And I think it can be revisited. So perhaps we could do that.
I would love that. I think that it should start not at the moment when we're in the Klieg lights of the confirmation hearing, because I think at that point, empathy derangement syndrome is in full tilt. So it seems to me that the time, given that Ruth Bader Ginsburg will soon be 80, I think that the time to do it is sooner rather than later, and to really set the table again, and to try to sort of reinstate a conversation about what it is that empathy brings that is so horrifying that we can't even use the word at a hearing, without spitting it out. And I think now is the time, and not in the future when it's too overheated.
Yeah, that's my sense too. It's like right now is the time to kind of bring those people together, have a cool, calm, collected as possible a dialogue about that, and kind of be prepared. So when the time comes, that it's already kind of mapped out, and there's material that the senators could actually look at and have something to inform their discussion. So who do you think are good people for that dialogue?
I'm going to have to think about it. I remember doing a really great panel, and I'm going to have to look up who was in it, at the Brennan Center.
I saw
in New
that,
York.
yeah. Uh-huh.
And had some people on that panel talking about empathy just around the Sotomayor hearings that I thought was really one of the most thoughtful conversations I had ever seen. So I would just say airlift those folks onto Skype, and that would be a start. But I also think, it's a very good conversation to have. Some of the folks who are writing about gender and empathy and being a minority, and in other words, I would like to have it in the absence of an actual nominee, because I think as soon as there's a nominee, it gets really freighted down with whatever their gender is and whatever, their sexual orientation. Like, that becomes the bias problem. So it seems to me that I think all these questions that are sort of ancillary questions about, are women more empathetic than men? I would like to see those explored before we know that the next nominee is going to be a woman, because I think then you can have a really rigorous conversation that isn't about, is Sonia Sotomayor biased? So I'll make you a list. I'll think about it. But I think it would be a really useful thing to frame it as, empathy versus sympathy. Why do we conflate the two, and sort of start from there?
Yeah. Regarding that, there's Simon Baron-Cohen. He wrote the book, The Science of Evil. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but I had a dialogue with him, and he talked about that. There's studies about the empathy relationship, between men and women. So it's to have the dialogue you had there at that panel that I saw. I think it was mainly lawyers. So I think that's what's really important, is to bring in other disciplines. So it's a cross-disciplinary dialogue. So it's great to have lawyers, but also, people like Simon Baron-Cohen, Franz de Waal, who's done a lot of work, wrote the book Age of Empathy, and Marco Iacoboni, who I've actually talked about, who did mirroring people. So he brings in the whole science of mirror neurons and the underlying, biological aspects. So, to bring all these people together, I think would be really quite fascinating, with yourself and others, to really unpack that. So that's the next project. So that's our next step. So
World Dominion. Okay, I think it's
empathic
great.
action. That's the empathic action component of this talk. So, well, this is great. I'm so excited to talk to you, and just you have such a wonderful way of looking at this, and very caring and open and warm. So I'm really thrilled to have had this chance to talk, and looking forward to our panel discussions around this.
I am too. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you're doing, because I really feel like, this lights the way to sanity for the rest of us. I mean, I really feel like something somewhere has to, kind of course correct, because the way we talk to each other and the way we fail to listen to each other in this moment in time in this country is not something I want to hand down to my children. So thank you.
Thank you. So we'll be talking soon.
All right.
Bye, Dahlia.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.